If we consider the human condition, and really taking the human condition as a whole, that is, looking at the human species as a conception that began thousands of years ago, my own view is that the human self did not evolve from an animal, and neither does the psyche come from the brain. So I see the animal evolution of the human body as one thing, the psyche as different from the body in its own dimension, and then the spiritual dimension as well, something quite different. And today we know that there might be the possibility of multiverses, many universes, and also many dimensions. But in the history of religion, mysticism and spirituality, there's usually been the idea of three levels: the spirit, the psyche and the body. So I use that tripartite structure. So I assign the self to the spirit, the one mind, the ego identity to consciousness, which is an integral part of the psyche, which means soul, and then you have the physical body with its brain. And I don't think that there's any reason to think that thought, which I think is a constituent of the psyche, there's no reason to think that thought and consciousness actually come from the brain. But it shouldn't matter whether, the fact is nobody really knows, so it's still open to question. When I think of the human condition and the term crisis, I think the crisis in human consciousness, in the realm of thought and knowledge and personality, the identity, the ego, that means if you take the role of the philosopher, if you go back into ancient times, and you have the natural philosopher that meditated east and west on the ideas, the fundamental ideas and meanings of life. And I think probably the earliest Homo sapien, and before the Homo sapien, the Neanderthal man actually buried the dead and left artifacts in the grave. So there's the idea that you're leaving the artifacts of the person in the grave, so you're thinking of a continuity of consciousness, a continuity of personality beyond the grave, and that the gifts or the artifacts will be taken by the deceased, as it were, symbolically, into the afterlife. Now, Carl Jung said that the land of the dead which is spoken of in Tibetan Buddhism and spoken of in Egyptian magic in their books of the dead, that the land of the dead is in the psyche. So if you imagine the psyche as a vast dimension that has many, many regions. So if you think of the physical universe, there are many galaxies, there are many solar systems, and in today's astrophysics there's the idea of exoplanets, which means exoplanets are planets where life can be supported. And the idea is that there could be millions or billions of intelligent life on other planets. So there could be intelligent life like human beings. And that was part of the theology of ancient Egypt and part of the theology of Tibetan Buddhism. Because when Buddha went into nirvana, transcendental wisdom, and put on the body of wisdom, they refer to that as the resting place. So when you're liberated from consciousness and you become your true self in the spiritual dimension of the one mind, then you could say that's a time of rest. And the time of rest would be a time of peace and freedom from the conditioning, from the burden of consciousness and the burden of knowledge. So if we go back into earliest times, say 25,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, you might say when human culture really began, as we know it today, paintings and such, and rituals and magic and that kind of thing, and then the beginning of civilization in ancient Egypt, Samaria, in the Hindu Kush near India. So these vast regions of time, and go back with the idea that if you go back to the origin of what might have been a problem within consciousness, that was thought about by the natural philosophers. And the natural philosophers would have been possibly yogis, monks, shamans, people that contemplated and meditated about life after death. That kind of idea. Does the human soul and the human self survive death? You could say maybe on a very serious level, that's what people were really concerned about. And as I say, in Egyptian magic, the idea was that the soul and the self, which is the ka, the individuality, the ka, the self, and the ba, the soul, that they transmigrated, as it were, from the earth to other planets in the star systems of Orion, for example, or Draco or Sirius, that kind of thing. But I don't think there was a division for the Egyptians between life after death in going to another planet or life after death in going to another dimension, which would involve the physical and the psychic. And in today's ufology, it's often said that the UFO intelligences can be interdimensional, so that they can move between the psychic and the physical dimension. So anyway, if you think that what occupied the certain philosophers in the ancient world And you think today that people interested in spirituality also meditate on the idea of life after death, in terms of certain experiences that could be had that make you think that there's some other level operating other than consciousness. And usually in the mystical tradition of the wisdom tradition, the indicators and signs that there might be other dimensions and even other planets with intelligences is what you might refer to as revelation. And revelation is really the revelation of the spirit. And the revelation of the spirit is in symbolic and mythological terms. So you could say that the UFO is a kind of symbol or a myth. So Carl Jung said the UFO is the modern myth of the 21st century. And he saw the UFO form as a mandala, a circle, and that would represent the Godhead like Buddha or Christ in symbolic form. So the circle can represent the one mind. So you could think of the alien intelligences as enlightened beings like Buddha. So the idea is to understand revelation as coming from a spiritual dimension via the psyche. And the psyche is where language and symbol and myth and dream and vision and the land of the dead, etc. could exist. So my idea is that through revelation, the spiritual mind is awakened in the human being. So, for example, at the age of 23, I feel that my own mind was awakened in self-awareness, and I could then see the distinction between consciousness and the spiritual mind. And consciousness is the domain of the identity and the ego. So you could say it's interesting that before that happened, I was a university student in New York State, near New York City, and I studied philosophy. And that's just a kind of coincidence that I studied philosophy. I didn't want to stay in college. I left college. I had an awakening of my spiritual nature, or the one mind. So in a sense, I became, you might say, a spiritual philosopher. Of course, I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't practice any meditation. I didn't know anything about spirituality and religion. But the point is that I did begin, you might say, a philosophical inquiry, or a philosophical self-inquiry, known as self-knowledge. Now, I see the idea of the human condition of consciousness and ego and identity in which we all live in the world, because we're all identified in different ways, in religion and politics and psychology and music and art. We've all got identities within society. We all put on the persona and the mask of the personality in the psyche, which takes the form of images and ideas and numbers, language. And once you understand that there is such a thing as the mind, which is the place of the self, as it said, the resting place of Buddha, which is the true self, the individuality, then what happens to your perception of consciousness? What happens when you look at your life in the past? In my case, right up until I was a university student, so my identity as a university student, as an English person in America, I grew up in Oxford, and all my history, my life story, all of my accumulated memories and experiences right up until the age of 23, that was my consciousness, that was my identity. And with the awakening of myself, with the realization that self was there all the time, self is not ego identity, and the mind allows you to discriminate between ego and identity. So how did I look at myself in terms of consciousness? How did I look at my identity? Well, what happened from that time on, I didn't, you might say, function in my consciousness with an ego center. So after that time, my consciousness didn't have a central identity, i.e. that I was a student. So I never took on another identity like that. So you might say, what was in my memory in terms of my consciousness never presented me with a problem. The consciousness just functioned normally. I mean, I had my character, my personality, my memory of it, living in England, etc., and studying. I had my memory, I had the knowledge, experience, all of that. It all remained perfectly clear, only I never needed to identify with anything because I was self-aware. So you might say, I never took on an occupation, and even though I wrote poetry and I did art, I never saw myself as a poet or an artist. I just did poetry and art. I didn't need to establish an identity within society, because I wasn't interested in society. I wasn't interested in institutions. So really, I began to learn about myself in life, and that learning about myself in the whole of life, including consciousness and the world, was really a self-inquiry, was really self-knowledge. And that's when I started to have very subtle perceptions, very subtle forms of revelation and synchronicity and epiphany and visions and dreams, etc. And I think that they came along with the awakening of the mind. And you might say, when the body and consciousness is left alone, when they work on their own, without any control from the ego, when you're not controlling your experience, you're not controlling how you're living, you're not controlling what's going to happen in the future, then I think psychophysically, synchronistically, things start to happen. You get signs and indications of the spiritual dimension working through what I call the act of creation. So in the wisdom tradition it says that the spiritual dimension is beyond the body, and so the revelations are coming from beyond the body via the psyche. So the spiritual dimension awakens in the psyche symbols and mythology that form the roots of magic and religion, and they relate very much to the ancestor worship, the land of the dead, which people say they have access to, like the shamans. And Carl Jung talked about going in his astral body and meeting people that had died that were close to him, like his mother and father and his wife. He said he spent time with them after they had died in the psyche. So you could say, in a certain way, the crisis for the human being from time immemorial, from the very beginning, when you might say the psyche connected to the body in what Aboriginals call dream time. So you could say, they say the Alkaringa is the golden age of their ancestors who were actually mythical beings. So what they're saying is, in the very first human beings, the psyche came into the animal body in a form of dream. So when the psyche connected to the brain, as it were, then the network of consciousness was set in motion, and people that were on the earth in Aboriginal times, they were dreaming. So they were dreaming when they went to sleep, but they were dreaming when they were awake. So the world around them was a kind of dream. Of course, the physical universe, for myself, is a real fact. There is a physical, factual universe. But what I'm saying is that when the Aboriginals in their consciousness were dreaming while they were awake in the world, then you might say that coloured their vision. So they might have seen the world in a more of a like a paradise, and various people can see the world in terms of that kind of paradise. And I myself have had experiences exactly of that nature, where I've actually experienced the world as a kind of paradise. And what that means is that ordinarily you have a very common sense view of the world. You know, you see the colours and you see the trees and the river and the sky in a very basic way, basic colour, basic shape and everything. Everything looks fairly neutral. But when you're in certain states of mind, as it were, states of consciousness, then things can become more colourful, more vivid, and they can be what's called numinous. So there's a kind of spiritual presence. There's an awakening of spiritual perceptions, so that you see the order in the universe, you see the beauty in the universe. And that's what poets and artists and composers and philosophers and mystics, that's what they write about when they have changes in their vision, changes in their altered states of mind or altered states of consciousness. So it is very much like when you dream. When you dream, it can be very colourful, can be much more vivid in colour, and like a softer light, like a vivid light but quite soft light. And that's called the numinous, the divine presence in the world. So if we look at the crisis in consciousness for the very first people, and still relevant today for people today that are involved in spirituality, which is, do we survive death? And I think that idea comes from the fact that we don't actually belong here. The self doesn't belong here, and the soul doesn't belong here, the personality, the person. Because in the Gospels it says that, that Jesus was a person, and then he awakened as Christ. So Christ is the self, which is synonymous with God, the Lord God. And then you have the Holy Spirit, which is like the person, the soul. So if you think of the deepest level thought, the deepest level idea, the deepest level feeling, the deepest level intuition inside of all of our consciousnesses, I would think there are two things. There's the fear of death, and yet at the same time, in a kind of paradox, there's the question that, do we survive death? So there's the physical fact that we know we're going to die, and the fear arises because we don't know if we actually do survive death. If we knew we've survived death, then we wouldn't have the fear. I mean, it is human nature. It's human nature to fear death. And that's what is going on in consciousness. And that's related to the identity. So in our personality, in our identity, we're afraid of death. So we're identified with other people, with the family, with the country. We're identified with the work we do. We're identified with the house, with what belongs to us. We're identified with our memories, with our life, whether it was good or whether it was bad. But we don't want to die to that. That's why they buried things in the grave. We don't want to die to that memory, that identity. And it's the identity in consciousness, the ego identity, that actually fears death, because you fear that you're going to lose everything. But once you're awakened to yourself in the mind, then there's no longer any fear of death, because in a sense, you don't actually need to have an identification with anything in your consciousness. You don't need to hold on to that, to be attached. But that doesn't mean that you can't value everything you've got, and the people you know, and the world you're leaving behind, as it were. But if you could awaken to the self in the one mind, then that fear wouldn't arise. And as I said with me, when I had the awakening at the age of 23, I no longer was identified with my consciousness, but everything in my consciousness remained just as it is. I had friends, I valued my education, I valued the books I read, I valued what's going to happen in the future and everything. So nothing changed, it's simply that I wasn't identified. And if I moved from America, as I did, back to England and off to India, etc., and I left friends behind, I didn't have any property, etc., it didn't bother me. It didn't bother me that I left things behind, because I didn't have any identification or attachment to them. So if I had a synchronicity or a vision, and something extraordinary happened to my perception of the world, etc., I wouldn't become attached to those experiences. They simply would be memories that I value, but I wouldn't have any identification with them, because in self, in the one mind, you're free. You have this sense of freedom. So it literally means that in that freedom, therefore, there's no attachment in consciousness, and so the freedom is the freedom. And in consciousness, whether you have some books or not, whether you have a friend and you move and you start a new life somewhere, and so forth, and you learn to navigate without forming an identity. So I think that the fear of death and the question whether we survive death is really, I would say, the most critical level within our consciousness, that's operating all the time in the background, and it really rests on the idea of the philosopher of self-enquiry, of making the distinction between the identity in consciousness that's afraid of dying, and the freedom of the self in the spiritual dimension, in the one mind, making that distinction. And that's why spirituality is so important. Not to everybody. I mean, the way the world's conditioned, I mean, in the modern age, people that are scientists and evolutionists and materialists and atheists, they have no interest in religion, and that seems to be perfectly all right. They just live their life and do whatever they want to do. I mean, when I grew up, there was no religion in my house. So my parents died without any sense of religion. They just died, and I think that's perfectly all right. They lived their life and had their own thoughts about life, their own meaning about life, and I don't see why it's the concern of people that are interested in spirituality to think that other people should be interested in spirituality, or that spirituality is a panacea, or it's going to cure everything in the world, if only we were enlightened. I think spirituality works in its own way. I don't think you can apply it to consciousness or apply it to the world. So all those paranormal, parapsychological effects of healing and telepathy and clairvoyance, they're all psychic effects. There's nothing to do with the spiritual reality. in the modern period, people have ideas of a crisis in science and religion, you could say. The reductionism of scientists about religion, so that they're not including religious discourse in the public space, as it were. And what's happening with technocracy, becoming a globalized society, and the idea of genetic engineering and supercomputers, and becoming more efficient than the human brain, as it were, and that kind of thing, of maybe influencing human thought, and maybe to do with maybe programming human beings in some way from a supercomputer base, as it were, satellite, etc. I don't find that a crisis myself. I don't think technocracy, scientism actually poses a crisis. I think it's got elements of certain problems, ethical problems in genetic engineering and supercomputers and artificial intelligence. And I think we're dealing with those ethical problems. I think on the level of the nuclear problem and climate change, I think people are addressing those. So I don't feel, for myself personally, that there is a crisis. And I think as normal, really, going back thousands of years, there are people that take the spiritual question of survival after death, of transcendence, of deeper levels of understanding the universe, understanding reality and the nature of the self and personality. Yeah, there'll be a certain amount of people that take that seriously. There are certain scientists that are able to do serious research. There are certain people that can do painting and music. And so there are, right across consciousness, there are people taking things seriously. And I don't see any sign of worry. And I think one day we colonize the solar system and we make contact with other intelligences on other planets and even not on other dimensions. Who knows? But I think living day to day in the 21st century, I don't feel any fundamental disturbance or crisis in my consciousness, and I never have. In 73 years, I've never felt that. But you could say my awakening at the age of 23 was a crisis. It was what I call an identity crisis, because at that time, when I thought there was a disturbance in my brain, because I didn't know anything about the psyche or the spirit, and I didn't know about consciousness and the brain or anything like that. I thought there was a problem in my body, in my brain, and went to the doctors, and nothing was really, I didn't kind of get anything out of that. So I lived with this very dark, disturbing, quite menacing internal drama, as it were, like a psychosis. And then that passed in a number of weeks, and I felt very free. I felt self-aware. I felt the presence of a profound understanding and awareness of myself and the world. And then within a year I read the sacred text, realized it was the one mind, realized that I became self-aware, and I felt peaceful and free. So I went through a dark phase into the light, you could say, from an identity crisis, where in that void within, as it were, in that void, in that dark night of the soul, my consciousness, my identity, the ego-centeredness of consciousness obviously felt threatened by a deep disturbance in the organism. And I felt like I was being drawn down into a kind of vortex, and I was going to lose consciousness. And there was almost a sense of my life was threatened, as if I was going to go mad or suicidal. It was very, very shocking, traumatic, because nothing like that had happened before. I didn't even know I had those deep levels inside me, in the psyche. I had no idea about that. I never suffered from any real fear or insecurity, but I became profoundly insecure, which meant my ego identity felt very insecure and threatened. And that's talked about in Tibetan Buddhism, that when you enter the void or you come near the void, the ego is threatened. And once you enter into the darkness of the void, it comes into the clear light of the one mind, which is what they call a psychological death. You undergo a psychological death. And that's actually synonymous with actually physically dying. You black out when you die, just as when you go to sleep, you black out and then you dream. So you go into your psyche. Likewise, when you die, there's the shock of death, and then there's the blacking out, and then you can either go into your psyche, into the land of the dead, etc., or you can go straight into the one mind, the clear light of the one mind. So I'd gone through that process so I could differentiate the three levels, so I didn't mix them up. And I could see clearly you've got the physical body, the animal body in nature and the physical universe. You've got ego identity and consciousness and the psyche to do with language and dreams, etc. And then you have the spiritual nature of the self. And that's a very, very clear distinction. And you wonder why human beings think in terms of apocalypse, think in terms of extinction, which is part of the natural process anyway, but the idea that human beings could destroy themselves. I mean, again, I've never had that, I've never felt that. I mean, in my life I've mixed with lots of different people in different countries, etc. And I just feel people, I've always felt people are intelligent, they're respectful, they're dedicated to what they're doing, their work, their family, etc., their country, whatever, their culture. And they're trustworthy, moderate. So I never feel threatened by other people, and I don't feel that there's any cause for alarm in just the everyday condition and state of people around me. There's no reason to feel insecure, there's no reason to feel that there's a disturbance in the human race or the human consciousness or so forth and so on. But I think if you get inundated by watching, say, television and the news and all these programs, and you listen to all this propaganda and everything. Of course, you can get an overload. Well, I never listen. I never watch television or listen to the radio and read newspapers or anything like that. So I've never got my information about the world from religious people and all kinds of political propaganda and all that. So I just get, my sense of people are from the people around me that I meet in the shops and I go around the city. I mean, that's my sense of people. And my sense of people is that everything's all right. And I've always felt that. I mean, if at the age of 22 I hadn't left university and I maybe studied philosophy and I became a teacher of philosophy or something like that, and lived my life without any sense of religion or spirituality, I don't think it would have made any difference at all. Because why should I think that my family, my mother and father, for example, why should I think their life is any less valuable than my own because I'm spiritual? I mean, or I'm an artist, or I'm a scientist, or I'm whatever. Why should it make any difference? I mean, if you're disabled, your experience of your body or your mind, if you're mentally disabled, whatever, is obviously different from people that have got a healthy body, healthy mind, as it were. And I don't think it's right to compare people and think that what you're doing, for whatever reason, is more significant than somebody else. And obviously there are overt problems when people are in a state of conflict or violence in the world, in the family, or in between countries. Of course, you have to attend to those specific problems. And they do arise, and there are nuclear problems in nuclear power stations, that kind of thing. But there are also tsunamis and earthquakes, etc. So I think, yes, there are these sporadic problems that go on. But as I say, if you've got spiritual insight, and you've got something spiritually to say to other people, or to write books or make videos or whatever it is, I mean, go ahead and do it. But I think you're just offering another point of view. You're sharing your life meaning, your life experience. And that's true of anything with art and music and politics. You're just one amongst many people, and there's nothing extra special. I don't think you should think literally that there's anything particularly special about religion or particularly special about Buddha or Christ, because Buddha, Christ and God, they only refer to your sense of self. But your sense of self is with you anyway, whether you're able to make the distinction between identity and self. It's a very subtle difference. The mind is very subtle. But if you're in a family and your sister is a happier person than you, then she's a happier person than you. And if your brother is more successful than you, so be it. I mean, if you enjoy experiencing synchronicities, you enjoy reading sacred books, then that's fine. But if you're interested in reading poetry, or just enjoying nature, or enjoying travel, or going to museums, or whatever, whatever suits the person. But I don't think spirituality is a panacea. I don't think the world is a better place because of spirituality, because I'm not going to make judgments on other people's lives. Why should I overvalue my own life above anyone else's? I don't agree with thinking religion is a form of propaganda, and messianic, and you've got a mission, and you're a voice in the wilderness, and you're going to save humanity, and that kind of thing. I think that's all just, that's just belief, idealism, and utopianism. But also there's a lot of doom and gloom in a lot of apocalyptic ideas and so forth. And a lot of spiritual teachers contrast spirituality with consciousness, and saying that consciousness is just self-deception, is the source of the human problem, and is destructive, etc., etc. But I don't agree with that. I think consciousness is consciousness, and people, have all varying degrees of positive and negative experience, and people deal with their own problems, and on a global level, international level, national level, local level, group level, personal level. We're dealing with our problems in consciousness. Don't think there's any right way to solve problems within consciousness. Just an ongoing thing, day by day. So no, spiritually, I have no particular message, no particular projection of solution or advice or judgment of anything. I don't think there's any need to get upset about anything like that.